Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today I'm joined by political theorist, writer, rock and roll terrorist, and heartbreaker Thomas777. Thomas, how are you?
Doing just great, Scott. Thank you for the generous introduction.
Oh, you're welcome. I saw today people were accusing you of being a cringe beta, and you had to post one of your infamous, powerful mirror selfies to stop down the haters, to shut up the haters as you want to do. Why do people always keep attacking you?
I don't know, man. I think it's twofold. I think the one thing that's happening is that like a lot of people do not have rock and roll in their life, and they prefer to conform. They prefer to take whatever Fox News tells them to think and they accept that as gospel. And there's just they just don't have balls. And one of the reasons why programs like yours are so fantastic is because they allow us an outlet to spread the gospel of rock and roll, and hopefully help people on the right find their testicles once again, because they seem to have gone missing.
That's true. And we are talking about a rock and roll topic today. We are talking, of course, about John F. Kennedy, who the Misfits made a great song back in the late 70s called Bullet, which didn't quite have a somber tone to expressing the death of JFK, which at that time would have been pretty offensive. But before we go into his assassination, we want to go into the man himself. A lot of right-wingers like JFK, and do you think right-wingers are right to idolize him?
I do not. I think it's conceptually illiterate for anybody. However, there's an internal logic to why they do that. And so people have they've got a real deep nostalgia for the early 60s. Like, I'm sure you remember how when Mad Men was a real kind of pop culture phenomenon. Yeah. I mean, you're familiar with Mad Men, right? Okay, well, there's this kind of fetishistic almost nostalgia for the 1960s prior to, these high profile killings of Kennedy himself, not even right about half a decade later, like his brother, Martin Luther King, Wallace was shot, but he wasn't killed. People look at the 60s prior to the Vietnam escalation, prior to the kind of, severe ramping up of political violence
and the counterculture.
Yeah. They look at it as like a time when America was still riding high after, victory in the good war, which in their mind is World War II. They look at it as a time that was full of kind of uncorrupted potentiality that just somehow got, derailed by a convergence of circumstances and, hippie types who weren't adequately patriotic. And I believe to them that, Kennedy, kind of in symbolic psychological terms, represents a prime symbol, if that makes any sense. In terms of Kennedy, the man himself, what he should represent to an informed historian, or to somebody who's just trying to familiarize himself or herself with our cause and kind of develop a grounded sense of how we got to this point. Kennedy, I cannot really take anything away from him and the way he managed the missile crisis in '62. That was a bona fide. That was a bona fide crisis. There was splendid information awareness in a way that was not in later nuclear crises. I'm speaking of '73 and '83, both of which were genuine crises. Make no mistake. But at the same time, Kennedy was an untested president. He was under tremendous pressure from Curtis LeMay. He was under tremendous pressure simply as a president who had to do something to guarantee his own incumbency looking forward. And he the way Nixon had portrayed him was as a man who really didn't have the fortitude to stare down the communists when it came to a real bona fide national security challenge. And any man who can perform effectively under those conditions, I think, is a remarkable man. And the fact Kennedy, I cannot think of any errors Kennedy made in terms of the crisis resolution. And there's some things he really did right. I mean, that really set the Soviet Union back in political terms, and it scared the hell out of them in military terms. But it did so without an actual deployment of forces. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. I don't want to get on too much of a tangent about geostrategic and war and peace matters, but I believe this is a point that really cannot be overstated, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, and with that, I agree that that was a unmitigated success for him. I mean, and it was making up for his disaster of the Bay of Pigs, which he showed weakness there. He's like, okay, we're going to go along with this, and then it became a half-assed military measure. They planted these Cuban militia on a beachhead that was perfect for the defenders, but not for the assaulters. And then they didn't give America, and then they were totally wiped out, and it was a massive embarrassment for Kennedy. But at the same time, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, he resisted, as you were saying, the hardliners and Curtis LeMay, who was the commander of the Air Force at the time, and others who were demanding, like, let's go to war, let's like bomb the shit out of them. Let's go, let's show them we mean business. And he just simply had a blockade around Cuba, not letting people in while he was, having the channels of diplomacy and negotiating, and eventually came to a resolution that was ultimately beneficial to us and, showed the Soviet Union as the weaker partner in that regard, or the weaker opponent in that matter. So yeah, that is one thing that he did well. But if you look at a lot of the things that, particularly from a domestic side, he was terrible. I mean, before he became president, he wrote a book that was published by the Anti-Defamation League called Nation of Immigrants, which popularized the term and talked about how we need to get rid of the 1924 Immigration Act. And we need immigrants because they make us who we are. And my family are Irish mix, and we came over and we made this country great. So that's one thing. He was also, and compared to later people, he was more modern on civil rights, but he did ultimately agree with civil rights. But he was still trying to keep the Southern segregationists within this party, so he wasn't going full bore on with it, but he was reluctantly going along with it. And his brother Robert Kennedy, of course, was much more into the civil rights and was always his liberal conscience talking to him and demanding that they more aggressively pursue a civil rights agenda. But he was not really, didn't have much sway on the Capitol Hill, which we'll get into this in a moment. But LBJ had the sway on Capitol Hill to get it done, which he did not have the ability to do. And also LBJ accomplished the 1965 Immigration Act in part as a way of securing JFK's legacy. And the 65 Immigration Act was something that, the whole Kennedy wanted. I mean, Ted Kennedy also was the lead Senate advocate of it. And he was saying that this is what my brother wanted. And that's in part helped it pass. So his legacy is, mass immigration, the civil rights regime that totally transformed America and separated it from, how it was historically being as a nation for the historic American people. It separated it from that. And also his foreign policy issues. It was mostly standard hawkishness. He portrayed himself as the true hawk in the 1960 election against Nixon, which people would think is like, what? But that was his position. He was like, I'm going to be harder core against the Soviets than Eisenhower. And that's how he presented himself. And he helped, get us further into Vietnam. The best and the brightest that were surrounding him were the same people who were like, let's do this. We can win this war. And under Johnson, of course, they went further into the escalation. So there's not really, I mean, yeah, the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of his great traits, but at the same time, it's not necessarily the best. And also, the one thing you want to see is the Kennedy family themselves is representative of the Ellis Islander class overtaking the WASP aristocracy in our country. And they were very explicit about this matter. Kennedy, when he won his Senate seat, I believe it was 52, he defeated Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who Henry Cabot Lodge's, the Lodge family were almost the embodiment of the New England WASP aristocracy. And Lodge's grandfather, Henry Cabot Lodge, defeated John F. Kennedy's grandfather in, I think it was 1916, I believe, one of those races. And his grandfather had a huge grudge against Lodge, and he always used to claim that he went up to Lodge when they were on Capitol Hill to address him about a bill, and he was talking to him, and then Lodge went to him and was like, why are you in my country? Which likely never happened because Lodge had to appeal to the Boston Irish in Massachusetts. Even at that time, they were a large constituency, and he wasn't necessarily this WASP villain. But at the same time, the Kennedys were defeating the Lodges. The Lodges were fervently nativist, believed in America. They believed in a historic American people. They were not about this, at least in the early 20th century. I mean, Lodge Jr. became a huge Cold Warrior who didn't necessarily care about the same issues his grandfather did. But they were overtaking this class, and they're creating a new America that in part led to the America we see today. And that aristocracy or the elite that Kennedy spearheaded with his election of being the first Catholic. It was ushering in and saying, this is Ellis Islanders' country now. It's no longer this country for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. You have to share it with us. And that later meant, you have to share it with Indians and Africans and Guatemalans as well. And so that began the spiral. And then a lot of people see that. And that's also part of the popularity of Kennedy, is that he broke through this barrier that we supposedly had against Catholics with his election.
Well, yeah, I think, and that's a narrative that's profoundly overstated. I mean, by the Irish themselves, but also by immigrant Catholics generally. However, I will say this: E. Michael Jones, who's I take his stuff pretty seriously. I mean, I'm very much a Presbyterian. I don't take his theology as something that I feel is correct, but the stuff he writes about the history of social engineering in America and how post Nuremberg this really became the raison d'etre of the American left. Jones posits that, look, the way to understand America is essentially its dynamics are not unlike that of Bosnia at a massive level. Like the real dyad of conflict in America is between Catholic, Protestant, and Jew. And if you really want to understand how those dynamics come to bear in policy questions, like where the rubber meets the road, look at the demographics of the Supreme Court in any given era. Because, as you know, I'm sure the Supreme Court is the truly sovereign organ of government in America, perverse as that is. But and that's a whole other issue that's a bit outside the scope of what we're talking about. But yeah, the 20th century, in terms of domestic policy and ethnic politics at the elite level, it was very much a battle between Catholic, Protestant, and Jew, and each faction utilized his own proxy warriors to implement. To advance his discrete agenda. And Kennedy absolutely was walking a tightrope between, to your point, preserving this New Deal coalition that no longer really made any sense, both in terms of, the way the constituent elements of it, the people within it, self-identified, nor did it make real sense in policy terms because the interests that, that represented the ties that binded these people during the Depression, like, really no longer were existent. But at the same time, yeah, I've got mixed feelings on Kennedy and civil rights. There's a fascinating subtext just because of how crazy it is. Like I'm sure you've seen the film JFK by Oliver Stone, have you not? From 1990 or 91?
I've seen most of it. I don't know if I've ever seen like a full, but I know the gist of it. Yes.
Okay. Well, that film is based entirely on Jim Garrison's book On the Trail of Assassins, and Garrison was a New Orleans district attorney who actually brought an indictment against Clay Shaw, who was this kind of this effete, gay guy, like New Orleans society type man. So in a lot of ways, Clay Shaw was not an admirable character, but he certainly was not, engaged in sedition or subversion. But Garrison confabulated this deranged narrative that somehow the John Birch Society and these vestigial kind of, far-right America First elements, they hated Kennedy with a passion. So, they essentially were able to corral these, kind of disturbed individuals like Oswald who were radical Marxists, in so doing, convincing them that, Kennedy was the source of their woes and, Kennedy was this arch hawk and, if he can be removed from the equation, that then, the Soviet Union can peaceably pursue its march to the future and, and continue to implement, a global socialist regime. Like, that's totally insane for all kinds of reasons. And that's the zenith of kind of unhinged conspiracy theory. But also, it's a bizarre kind of gaslighting almost. Like this idea that, the quote right wing hated Kennedy. Like the hard right, if we can define the hard right as, what did remain of Taft and America First conservatives, if we can also define it as, people who did join organizations like the Birch Society, Kennedy was not really on their radar. I mean, they didn't have a lot of love for him, but he really was not a lightning rod for controversy on civil rights. You know, despite the fact I do not think he had an ethical posture on those issues at all. But he was very, very careful, again, to your point, not to insinuate civil rights issues into his policy platform in any kind of flagrant, direct way. So, you know, in my opinion, I think the relationship of Kennedy to the right, I mean, yeah, he was a globalist. Yeah, he was an open borders proponent. I mean, yes, he did advocate, you know, this notion that, you know, we've got to create, you know, a world society that welcomes everybody if we're going to win the Cold War, because otherwise, you know, we can very much be posited in the wrong camp by the communists, who, at least according to their public statements, you know, believe firmly in, you know, the cause of national liberation and an end to discriminatory practices. However, I could say that about any post any post New Deal president. You know, that's just become the moral linchpin of state policy, and it touches and concerns everything. But yeah, I guess the brass tacks, what I'm getting at for purposes of our particular discussion, is that it's virtually impossible to get a proper handle on what exactly transpired in the months leading up to Kennedy being killed, and what the political landscape of America actually looked like, because the sources that are immediately available in popular media are just totally and completely off base, if not out and out confabulatory. I mean, does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense.
Great.
And not just from, I mean, popular conception of the whole era of the civil rights era and everything is totally off base. They're not necessarily giving. Imagine if history was written from the perspective of how CNN covered this summer's riots over George Floyd, and now think of that as how they covered the early '60s. So, and it's very much in a similar way. And you alluded to this, is that a lot of the push for the civil rights came from Cold War imperatives. And what would happen is the Soviet Union would mock us for saying, oh, well, you don't let blacks drink at the same water fountains. And then they're like, oh, no, we're so embarrassed. You guys got to let them drink at water fountains. You have to let them at your schools because the Soviet Union is telling us we're racist to Africans, and we have to win over the Africans and the Asians to our side. So we have to eliminate segregation, and we have to integrate our schools, and we have to have busing, and we have to totally dramatically eliminate the traditional Southern way of life just to, you know, as a PR strategy to win over Africa and Asia, and gets the threat of global communism. So that was a large part of it, the Cold War imperatives, and it was like the similar thing. And it's like how China will like send out a press statement about George Floyd dying. Well, that was very much in the case when, you know, they saw a riot going on in Birmingham, a police riot, you know, and of course the national media wouldn't cover it fully and see that like the one side clearly provoked it with their own violence and the police responded in kind. But they would just say that, like, look at what these American fascists do. They're unleashing their dogs and water hoses on their own citizens. This is terrible. Are you seeing this, Africa and Asia? This is the great white supremacist power. So in a large part, that's why they pushed for integration and busing and everything that went along with it. And yeah, to your point about why the far right may have not hated Kennedy at first, and you have to remember is that the far right was immediately blamed for JFK's assassination when it occurred. There was some group that was affiliated with General Edwin Walker, who was you know, a famous right-wing figure. He was also a homosexual, but he was fervently opposed to, you know, the civil rights movement and strong anti-communist. And some of his stuff, and clearly his sexuality came out because they thought of him as a threat, and they obviously revealed that to embarrass him and to silence him. But he put out some graphic that I believe it had like a target on Dallas, not even on JFK. And I don't even know if it was the same day. And they're like, look, the far right planted this. Lee Harvey Oswald is clearly a right-wing nut. We've got to shut down these people. And Edwin Walker was involved in a lot of these investigations, even though he clearly had nothing to do with it. And he's like, yeah, we had nothing to do with this communist. So initially, the original conspiracy theory was that the far right planted this. But they didn't, even though they still, in some of these people who still believe in the JFK conspiracy theory. They claim the far right was still involved because the CIA killed him. But we'll now move into that topic, as all of our listeners have been waiting for us to talk about the assassination theories. So you controversially, because this is a controversial point for a lot of people, and 61% of Americans believe that there was some conspiracy, you actually argue that the official narrative is largely true. Here's what you tweeted, I think it was a month ago. Quote, fun fact, Lee Oswald, a lifelong Marxist-Leninist who had lived in the USSR, who declared his intention to murder the president, actually did murder the president in front of tens of thousands of people. And after the fact, insane people claimed somehow this didn't occur, end quote. So why do you believe this?
Well, I think that, I mean, here's the thing when it comes down to, first and foremost, before we even get to the discrete kind of peculiar features of Oswald himself and the circles he moved in, before we even get to that, like, what exactly is accomplished if one kills the United States president? You know, it's the U.S. government is not built around, you know, some kind of deeply sovereign executive, you know, like we never practiced any kind of Peronism in this country. Okay, so the president, yeah, I realize Article 2 really does confer upon the president in you know, very, very hard, realist, and Schmittian terms, you know, the power to command forces that determine who will live and who will die, and the power that entails is awesome. Okay, at the same time, policy really does not originate with the president in America, and the fact of the matter is, why the man in the Oval Office makes a difference is because, assuming he has a strong mandate and assuming he's got a Congress that's not absolutely committed to sandbagging his initiatives, the function of the president is exactly that, an executive. He executes policy. He does not create policy. So, say, you know, in 1962, what would killing Kennedy really accomplish? Like, let's say, let's say some rogue elements of the intelligence community, you know, wanted to implement, you know, a proper coup of sorts, just for the sake of argument. I don't believe that, but let's go with that for a counterfactual. The way to do that would not be to murder the presidents. I mean, like, how would that exactly advance their goals? You know, I mean, it's like suggesting, you know, like when in a very different context, but the point is the comparative analogy stands, because I'm making a point about, you know, how the president is not, in fact, the linchpin of federal power. When John Wilkes Booth killed Lincoln, did Reconstruction fall apart? I mean, I know it hadn't been implemented then, but did that somehow save the South? Did that, you know, did the Union, you know, spontaneously go to pieces after that because Lincoln could no longer hold them together? No. In fact, by killing Lincoln, Booth actually made things worse for the South, because it created a power vacuum by which radicals who were very, very committed to a punitive regime being imposed on the South, you know, not only did they have a pretext for those draconian measures being implemented, but very ambitious men suddenly were able to gain a quorum of senators who had full confidence in them, because the great man Lincoln in their mind was no longer alive. So, like, what exactly would killing Kennedy accomplish in broad structural terms? I mean, like, so that's kind of the first point. Secondly, as I also pointed out on that same thread, you know, Kennedy was a man, he probably was what we'd call a sex addict today. He was a compulsive womanizer. He didn't just carry on with high profile, you know, starlets like Marilyn Monroe. You know, he was arguably literally addicted to having sex with prostitutes and just, you know, women who availed themselves to him, like the way some women do to powerful men. He had a drug problem. You know, he was in terrible health. You know, if somebody wanted to ruin Kennedy in 1962, it would have been very, very easy to do. I mean, it would have really just come down to, you know, somebody snapping candid shots of him engaged in some of these activities. And not only would his political career have been over, but there would have been abject moral outrage that, you know, this man was in the White House. You know, I mean, this was not 1998. This was 1962, 63. I mean, that's so even if Kennedy was some kind of linchpin of policy that had to be annihilated for some kind of deep state faction in order to conquer the corridors of state power, that's just not the way you do things in terms of intelligence ledger, man. You You don't literally shoot, blow the man's head off unless that's the only option to advance the objective. So I mean, it's those things. And finally, Oswald was basically what he said he was. He became radicalized as a teenager. There's direct testimony from people, friends and girlfriends and some of his extended family, that by the time he was 14, 15 years old, he was known to carry around Communist Manifesto in his pocket. He was known to rail against the government. This was as a young teenager, declare that, the Soviet Union's not getting, quote, fair play. The man, he was a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist-Leninist. That was not some kind of ruse. So you have this unhinged man who's got a very personal grievance as he perceived it against the federal government. He's got a history of violence. He kept a list of people he wanted to murder, including, and interestingly, Edwin Walker, as well as George Lincoln Rockwell, the kind of crazy vaudeville, like Nazi clown, self-described. So essentially, Oswald was a homicidal maniac and a radical Marxist. I mean, why is it hard to believe that this man would murder the president? I mean,
he was also a great shot as well. He was in the Marine Corps. He was rated as a very good marksman. And they always try to say, well, he was rated a poor marksman. Is like, no, his marksmanship skills were proved very satisfactory according to the Marine Corps. So and you even have pointed out in the thread that like the book depository which he fired from would have presented a great angle for him. It would have been
Yeah, and that's what's fascinating because I went to Dallas with a friend of mine because he was going to see his, a lady friend, and I wanted to see Dallas anyway. But the main attraction, if we can even call it, not to be morbid, but the main thing I wanted to see there was the Kennedy murder site, and one of the guys who was it's not really a museum, but they do have they do have these kind of interactive displays and photos in the book depository, and they preserved the makeshift sniper's nest Oswald used. It's really kind of creepy, but it's behind glass and everything. But in any event, this black guy who was the security there, some off-duty Dallas cop, I took notice of where Oswald was situated and the distance to where Kennedy was hit. It's not far at all. And I said that to this cop. I'm like, that's not a tough shot. And this guy's like, no, not at all. He's like people who claim it is. Either they've never visited here, or they've got no experience at all with firearms and don't really understand, what consists of a difficult shot to make for a trained marksman. To your point, or they're just kind of parroting like things they heard, on television infotainment outlets, or things they read from Jim Garrison. Like a highly trained marksman with a high-powered rifle at that distance, and the motorcade was moving at less than 3 miles an hour. I mean, that's something of a turkey shoot. I mean, why is that hard to believe? So yeah, I mean, all these things, as I kind of dug deeper into it, I'm like, there's not really a mystery here. It's very, very strange, and the way that it's endured it's almost kind of become like an American cultural myth unto itself, and people act like, if you do not accept that kind of wild theory, people act like you're being crazy. It's like you're
controlled by the CIA for disagreeing with what the vast majority of Americans believe in, and that it's so controversial that Hollywood made a movie about it, and mainstream publishers will easily publish books blaming the CIA for it. So but this is, you're controlled by the CIA for not agreeing with something that late night comedians would tout on their show. It's such a joke. I mean, it's like it's
weird too. It's weird too. If I could interject just for a moment, to your point about CIA, it's weird how CIA has kind of become this stand-in boogeyman. Like, don't get me wrong, I think the CIA is really kind of a blight on our collective existence in political terms. But CIA really, there's a great book about the Aldrich Ames case, and it's titled literally CIA and the Culture of Failure. Like CIA has got
the Aldrich Ames case, for listeners who may not know, that's the case of the high-level CIA informant who gave a ton of secrets away to the Soviet Union, and they couldn't find him for like 10 years.
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
but go ahead. CIA was really the Bay of Pigs really, really hurt them. in terms of their what vestigial credibility they did have. You know, in today's world, I mean, really, the CIA has not been taken seriously since Vietnam, and I made the point before too. It's really interesting that CIA is not assimilated into the SOCOM, you know, Special Operations Command structure in any like official capacity. That's fascinating because in the Vietnam War, I mean, SOCOM didn't exist then, but MACV-SOG was, you know, the proto-SOCOM, and it was basically a CIA operation, and you had these civilian CIA men and foreign service types, and these special forces, you know, hardcore special forces guys were expected and ordered to essentially do whatever they said, you know. But be that as it may, if people want to be afraid of an intel organization and have it stand in as a boogeyman, they'd be way better off invoking the Defense Intelligence Agency or the NSA. But defense intelligence from the 70s onward through the end of the Cold War and today, I mean, they are really kind of the hardcore human intelligence as well as data analysis kind of spook operation that's actually quite effective. But the CIA is something of a joke. And it's, yeah, I find it strange that so many people, that's their kind of boogeyman of choice. You know, it's, yeah, indeed.
Yeah, and the reason why is because it's the WASP stand-in. If you've ever seen the movie The Good Shepherd, and I've talked about this on previous episodes, there's Matt Damon is this evil WASP who's like he's stabilizing these uplifting, noble communist regimes in the third world, and he looks down on ethnic Americans. There's this famous scene which I've talked about with Cinderwood in the episode with Cinderwood, where Joe Pesci is listing off all the great things about all the ethnic minorities, and he's like, "Well, what do you guys got?" And it's like Matt Damon's like, "It's our country. You're just visiting," and you're like, "Oh, how could he say that? These wasps are so evil." And people really like the CIA, is it because they want to see this like Chad, blonde hair, blue-eyed guy who's got aviators on. He's got a polo. He's got in slacks. He just pulled out the sniper rifle. He's like chewing gum. He's like, Playboy in sight. Take him out. Hits JFK in the head. It's like Playboy down. You know, disassembles his sniper rifle, puts it in his briefcase, and walks away and goes visits his country club right after murdering the president, I guess.
No, it's a brilliant assessment.
Yeah, so it is like this Anglo resentment that comes over, and people want to blame it because they think that it's like the evil white man that's behind all this stuff. And so, of course, the leftists are really into this, blaming the CIA for everything. And you see this in a lot on the online left. They've really resurrected the JFK conspiracy as like a central part of their worldview, which makes no sense because JFK would have nothing to do with what, you know, Bernie Bros want. I mean, he was a defender of the free market and capitalism. He was a huge war hawk, and he believed in sending troops all over the world to protect democracy. I mean, they would consider him a neocon today if he was around. So I don't know why they think it's so important, but they create this myth that he was about to take down the whole deep state and the CIA and wipe out the WASP. I mean, culturally, the Kennedys were, you know, taking the WASP down, but in terms of, you know, the CIA at that time was still bringing in you know, some of the Ellis Islanders as well. I mean, it is like a more of a, if you read any of the histories about it, you can see even the incompetence with Alan Dulles' era of the CIA, who is ultimately seen as the real villain in a lot of these stories. I think the book, The Devil's Chessboard by Talbot, who is, I'm forgetting his first name. I think David Talbot is his name. He was one of the founders of Salon. Lefty guy who's written multiple books about how JFK
was. Is it Strobe Talbot, or am I losing my mind?
It might be Strobe Talbot. I think it's last name is Talbot. I'm pretty sure it's David. This is how is how our great prepping we do for highly respected. But anyway, he's written multiple books about how JFK was murdered by a conspiracy, and he ultimately blames Alan Dulles and the CIA. And Alan Dulles was sacked by JFK after the Bay of Pigs. And Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State under Eisenhower, are always seen as these evil wasps who were you know, out to conquer the world for I don't know, their country club. And that's like they have to see. I mean, they are not, I don't know if I'm reading a book about them, the brothers, which is I actually highly recommend. I'm not necessarily liking them, but they're not like these evil masterminds. I mean, most of the book is listing about how like they have all these harebrained schemes that they don't understand. And Alan Dulles would have this obvious information that he should have, but the CIA didn't even collect it. And he's like always seen as like more of a who's pitching himself to upper class society as like, oh, I'm the spy master, and he's like flying around the world, and he's like, I'm the #1 spy master. Meanwhile, his like spies are missing what's happening in the Suez Canal crisis in '56. They're missing what's happening in Hungary. They're not understanding anything that's, you know, they don't have serious information that's going on, and they clearly don't know what Ho Chi Minh is up to. And yet this guy's apparently can orchestrate the murder of a president, and nobody can notice. And also when they were doing these investigations in the 70s into this is when real crazy, you know, Congress had multiple testimonies, and this was at the height of everyone hating the CIA, of people having firm skepticism against the government. They saw what happened in Watergate. This is the time they would have blew the lid off it. If they knew that Alan Dulles, who was dead at that time, was behind the JFK assassination, they would have been happy to say that, so they could have taken down the CIA, and there would have been no defense for it. But they didn't happen. And anytime they looked at this, they're like, maybe it did happen. As they said.
You know what's fascinating too? One of the few ways that the Warsaw Pact consistently was beating the U.S. NATO was in human intelligence, and not just the Soviet Union, but the East German security apparatus. You know, the Ministry for State Security, colloquially known as the Stasi. Their counter espionage and their foreign intelligence directorate under Marcus Wolf was incredibly effective, and they were very, very good at insinuating disinformation into the American kind of public stream of consciousness. Like I came across a fascinating piece the Woodrow Wilson Institute. I mean, I think that their politics are abominable. However, they do corral a lot of fascinating documentary evidence. And they documented, one of the things in their collection is a lot of Stasi internal memorandum, like eyes-only type documents. And I don't know how old you are. I mean, you look like a young guy, and I mean, I'm turning into an old guy, so everyone looks young to me. But in any event, I don't know if you recall directly or not, but in the mid '80s, there was this story made the rounds that, you know, HIV/AIDS is actually like a bioweapon that the government lost control of, and now they're now purposefully directing it at, you know, non-white people and, you know, gays and things as some kind of eugenics effort, or it's not purposeful, but because, you know, it's only really taking down, you know, poor and undesirable people. It's just being allowed to happen. Okay, that wasn't some lefty journalist at Mother Jones who came up with that. That was Marcus Wolf and the Stasi, and they insinuated that into the international news kind of, you know, information stream. And it went, I mean, things couldn't probably be said to go viral in those days, but it went as close to being, quote, viral as things could in old media. And that's remarkable, because America was constantly trying to undermine the Soviet regime, you know, by creating these kind of disinfo worms to burrow into the into popular discourse behind the Iron Curtain, and they couldn't do it. But yeah, Western intelligence, to your point, has been a joke for a long, long time, and they were patently outclassed by the Warsaw Pact, and I find that fascinating. That on the technology side, in key ways, you know, NATO could make up for, you know, gaps in forces and being and things, really in ways that are kind of remarkable. But in terms of human intelligence, counter-espionage, it wasn't even amateur hour. It was just like naked incompetence and a constant a situation of operational failure that duplicated again and again and again. So yeah, I mean, that's another reason. It's asinine to view CIA as the kind of evil wasp, like the evil wasp, like Skynet or whatever. Like, to your point about
Jack Chads and blonde hair, they're at their country club. They're all like ready. It's like, how can we destabilize the world today? How can we put down the minorities today? And that's what they're doing in the left wing imagination.
Well, and they're remarkably bad at it. But yeah,
yeah, and it's like it's almost this badass image. You almost want to like root for the CIA in this case. Is like these guys look way cooler than who they're like attack. Like in The Good Shepherd, that movie, you're like, Matt Damon's kind of based. You're like, yeah, based?
No, he is.
Thanks, Matt Damon. Like that's right. And he throws out his son's non-white daughter who's clearly like a communist agent. They throw her out of a plane. You're like, based? He's like Cuck's son, but he's helping him out. But yeah, they want to say it as like evil. And to go back to the Aldrich Ames case of how showing of incompetence they are, and also dispelling this notion that they're all Jack Chads, like having cocktails in the country club in between taking out, Hispanic leftists in Guatemala or whatever. Like this case, they could not find, as we were saying before, they could not find this guy. And they spent all this money and effort to find him, and they created this team, and there's a picture of this team on the Wikipedia page about Aldrich Ames. And this team is like fat, chubby people, like dorks who have glasses on and mustaches, and you're like, I don't think these people are like secret agents like assassinating anyone. They're like, desk jockeys, and none of these people, they spent like 5 years trying to find him. And if I'm not recall correctly, they found him through a Soviet informant, not even on their own efforts.
Well, here's what happened. Like after the wall came, see, one of the fascinating things about Ames is that not only was Ames himself like a complete mess, like he'd been repeatedly sanctioned for literal drunkenness at work because he was a huge alcoholic. Like, and it got to the point where he couldn't get through the day without drinking to excess, and so he was already kind of under elevated scrutiny. I mean, but somehow one of the reasons why perestroika and glasnost like came as this great shock to the Western intel establishment is because Ames essentially outed every human intelligence asset in the Soviet Union, and the KGB from 84 to 86 executed all of them. So there's this total information blackout coming out of the Soviet Union, and at Langley, CIA is like, hey, gee, well, how come suddenly we're not getting any human intelligence data anymore? I mean, that's amazing in and of itself too, that they couldn't connect the dots. When the wall came down, and you had all these Soviet career KGB men who no longer, who were either handed their walking papers or still were retained in some, like nominal capacity, but really, we're living in destitution. They started selling everything they know, basically. So you had this glut of guys who'd been on the front lines of the intelligence battle between East and West, basically literally selling everything they knew to Langley. And one of these guys said, "Oh, by the way, Aldrich Ames is the man who dropped all your human intelligence assets on us, and we annihilated them." So I mean, how crazy is that? I mean, the fact is, it wasn't until the Cold War ended, and a former enemy operative was the one who essentially blew the whistle on it. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and he wasn't necessarily keeping it secret. I mean, he was like paying for his house in cash. He bought like a new car. He's wearing flashy suits, and they're like, how is he affording this stuff? And then like like a police department in like Cleveland would probably figure out a corrupt cop faster than the CIA would have figured out Aldrich Ames. And even this thing happened again in China, like all our human intelligence resources were wiped out a few years ago, probably for similar reasons. And even in this book, The Brothers, about the Dulles brothers, there's all these stories about how they have these elaborate intelligence plots, and there's a double agent working in on it. Like Alan Dulles was very proud of building a tunnel underneath East Berlin where they could hear everything. And during the whole project, there was a double agent overseeing it and like telling the Soviets about it. And the Soviets already knew that this tunnel was being dug underneath their city, and they immediately invaded it. And they didn't get much information. And
it's like the intel version of Police Squad in real life or something. It's like a goddamn slapstick comedy. And supposedly these are the people who are the deep state and have their heel on all our throats. It's like come on, man. Like that's just not. That's not, I mean, first of all, it's just not the way state power is organized, and nor is it the way that it functions. But it's just not credible. Yeah, you're absolutely right. These people are nerds. And I mean, Jesus, even the post-Cold War era, one of the problems with the lead up to 9/11 and the reason why there was total operational failure, the CIA literally had a dearth of people apparently who spoke Arabic. Like it's like, okay, so, the non-state actors who are supposedly, I mean, according to their own strategic forecasting, they didn't even have adequate people on staff who spoke the language of their primary opposing force that they supposedly were, actively engaged in trying to gather data on that would, save lives and avert, some kind of catastrophic attack. It's like, how can you not have people on staff who speak Arabic? I mean, this is like brass tacks stuff,
American bureaucracy at its finest. But they can pull off these massive conspiracy theories. They can't find anyone to speak Arabic, but they can eliminate our president with no one noticing.
Right.
So this is what they like to believe. The one point I want to go back to the immediate assassination before going through the rest of the culprits is that one of the big things that the conspiracy theorists like to point out is the magic bullet theory, is that this one bullet went through Kennedy multiple times, or went out, caused multiple wounds, and then it went into John Connally, who's the Texas governor at the time, and it's quite based figure, but it is a rare sight. Do you multiple shooters, or do you think that one bullet could have caused?
I don't know a lot about. I mean, I've got some experience with firearms, but I certainly am not any kind of expert. Not a forensic evidence, okay? And take this for what it's worth. The key that, I mean, when you're talking about when you're talking about the physics expert who can demonstrate, these very, very strange physics phenomena, multiple people who are struck by a single round, or that, a shot that does not seem like it was well placed at all, like, apparently by accident strikes its target, things of that nature. And I've never, there was the kind of knockoff cheat using, it had notoriously like wonky physics in terms of rounds fired. How was it? There's some witness who signed an affidavit claiming like, "Oh, I saw men by the grassy knoll." It's like,
yeah, the
okay,
hobo
I'm sure you saw a lot of people.
yeah.
But I mean, it's not. It's all. Eventually, what it is it's inductive in a way that's not persuasive, because they're just beginning with the premise like, see, there was a conspiracy. There just was. Oh, and I'm going to shore that up by saying like, how come like the Texas National Guard like wasn't available to be deployed, and how come this happened, and how come the way the police were deployed was not, what one would think is befitting, a presidential visit. It's like, in and of themselves, those things mean nothing. And I realize that circumstantial evidence, one must look at it as a total phenomenon and not just discrete factors therein in order to understand causality. But I have not, and admittedly, again, I am certainly not a forensics expert or a man who has experience with weapons in any meaningful way. But I have never seen a peer-reviewed study. I've never come across any true expert witness who has demonstrated in any persuasive capacity that that for some reason there just had to be secondary shooters. That doesn't and the burden's on them because they're the masters of the claim. I mean, they have to prove it up. So no, I've never seen I mean, honestly, the weirdest thing, and I don't want to go into a tangent, like the only truly bizarre thing about the entire incident is that Jack Ruby just hauled off and murdered Oswald. That is very, very strange. But again, that does not somehow implicate CIA or the deep state. I mean, Ruby himself was an unhinged individual, and the climate of the time was such that, like, we look at the president as kind of a front man, quite literally. I mean, everybody does, regardless of how they feel about the man in the Oval Office at any given time. In 1963, the president was like royalty. People were deeply and passionately involved in the symbol of the president. So it's not outside the realm of possibility Ruby killed Oswald simply for the reason he said. I was outraged and beside myself, and I wanted to kill the bastard. That's not incredible. That would seem incredible in 2020. It absolutely was not incredible in 63, if that makes any sense.
Well, I could see if like somebody assassinated President Trump, that like one of his supporters would try to kill him, coming out of jail. So you could very well see that, and a couple with other presidents. I mean, if that had happened if somebody had assassinated Obama, at the height of his popularity, you could have also seen something like that as well.
Oh, definitely.
And there would have been thousands of blacks who would have been willing to shoot like the guy who killed Obama, in that case. So it's not, but there is the connection with the Jack Ruby, is that brings in organized crime. So, going through all the list of possible culprits is that the mafia is commonly blamed for this. And there's even several movies, The Irishman, and others also like to implicate the mafia. And mainstream books about the mafia always try to implicate the mafia in JFK's death. So why do you believe that they couldn't have been involved in the conspiracy?
I look at it like this. I mean, I've studied. I don't generally go in for true crime because I think it's kind of lurid in a silly sort of subgenre. But given that I've lived my whole life in Chicago, it is something I am more than peripherally interested in, just because it's relevant to the place where I live. But also, if you want to understand the domestic security state, the police apparatus, you've got to understand kind of the whole theory of policing that emerged after the Second World War. And the idea of the mafia that is in both the public mind as well as in kind of the law enforcement conceptual horizon, it really owes to Joe Valachi. Like, you're familiar with who Joe Valachi was, right?
I believe so.
Okay, well, Joe Valachi was basically, he was this low-level, I believe he was a made man. He was more than just an associate, but he was a low-level mob guy. And he ended up turning state's evidence, and he was basically the first man who availed himself just as kind of a general purpose witness to the federal government. Okay, and Valachi testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Organized Crime, and Valachi painted this incredibly lurid picture of what he was, and he premised it in the most kind of melodramatic, hysterical language of what I'm telling you is going to shock you to the core. He's like, basically what Valachi said is, he said that there's an entire government of crime, literally, in the United States, and that every, and in those days, vice laws, pornography was illegal, cannabis was, a felony, gambling was highly illegal. Like, a lot of these kind of vices we take for granted now, like, were in fact crimes in those days in the 50s. So Valachi claims that, look, like, you want to know where all this kind of contraband comes from, you want to know who peddles it, like, you want to know who controls these illicit trades. He's like, there was a nationwide syndicate. That term, the syndicate, that pops up again and again in kind of police procedural stuff. Valachi coined that term. Valachi claimed essentially that the New York and Chicago mobs, like, control literally, like, all the action nationwide. They're like this shadow government. They're kind of this, like, empire of crime, almost like something out of a comic book. And the FBI and the Attorney General's office, they really ate this up for obvious reasons, because it gave them a whole new domain of their mandates. Okay, that said, the actual mafia, I mean, yeah, the mafia is a real thing, but it's essentially an ethnic drug dealing gang like any other. I mean, it's like, okay, Italian guys, who occupy a 10 square mile radius, like pushing heroin, running prostitutes, fixing local elections for aldermen. I mean, there's nothing really remarkable there. Like, I do not believe these guys are like the Joker in DC Comics, so that they're like this, shadow government that's, killing presidents and, has some kind of ability to control, like, all the illicit action in all American cities. Like, I think that's just crazy. I think it's based the FBI and the AG. I can't really see a bunch of it really astronomically outside of their league. I mean, imagine, like, what the response of law enforcement would have been. Can you imagine, like, what, like, outcry would have been? I mean, that it would have been unbelievable. Like, I mean, it seems totally insane. I mean, so that's you have the long-winded tangent, but that's my view of it.
No, I know cops and detectives, because they know the level of intelligence to know that they couldn't necessarily pull it off. But and again, that all these factors, they imagine that all these factions are together, that the CIA recruited some elite mafia assassin, who's straight out of a Batman comic. They call him the hitter, and they called him up to do the assassination. So instead of a blonde-haired Chad, it's some fat grease behind the fence who's like the greatest shot known to man.
Tony
He can
Meatballs.
just with one hand, he could just shoot somebody from a mile away, and that's all they need. So that's the imaginary thing. I don't know why they would use the mafia, because these guys love to talk and to brag about all their exploits. Just think about the amount of people who've claimed they've murdered Jimmy Hoffa. Yeah. I mean, they love to brag as like, hey, I may have not done this, but I did do it, and I'm gonna write a tell-all book right as I'm dying and saying I did it. So they love to brag and they love to talk about this stuff. So they would have never been able to keep this a secret. It's the same with our bureaucracy. Somebody would have eventually found out. So going through the rest of the culprits, I mean, LBJ, they always say is him, but he would have also had to use the CIA. He certainly benefited the most. The Kennedys were considering kicking him off the ticket. I don't know if they necessarily would have, because this is a central point in all these conspiracies that they were about to kick him off the ticket and he knew his political career was over. Of course, Bobby Kennedy didn't like him at all. But at the same time, when, you know, it does make sense that he would try to kill somebody that then he enacted that person's legacy. You know, maybe that's like a, you know, a total two-faced move, but you know, he would have had to rely on the CIA. And as we've talked about, that doesn't seem like a feasible policy. And I don't know if necessarily LBJ, if the vice president would have risked his entire, you know, his entire livelihood and the scorn of a nation to murder a semi-popular president.
No, exactly. And plus, too, you know, Johnson's entire, I mean, Johnson was in some ways a brilliant, I mean, he was a terrible person, but in some ways, he was a brilliant Machiavellian, like old school politician. But, I mean, Kennedy, you know, the last real gasp of the New Deal coalition, or the Democrats being able to corral, you know, the Solid South was the Kennedy campaign in '60. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, they took on LBJ precisely because he wasn't really ambitious at that point, because LBJ was essentially done. You know, I mean, I don't really think he had the fight in him to be president, and that's one of the reasons his administration was such a disaster. But I really cannot see. Yeah, I mean, just issues relating to his character. I can't really see him being that ruthlessly ambitious and single-minded. And secondly, again, too, like, yeah, how would that really? You know, considering his meal ticket was the Kennedys, because his career was as dead as you know, was as dead as can be.
As Kennedy himself.
yeah. It's like, so this guy whose career was suddenly necromanced by, you know, by the Kennedy brothers. He's gonna like whack them so that he can like replace them. Like that's again, that's like a Hollywood style like comic book bullshit. And plus, too, like, why would anybody do what LBJ said? I mean, it's like, okay, assuming to your point about, you know, the left has this crazy fucking conspiracy theory about the CIA. So, like, all these WASP, Chad, like, closet fascists or whatever who run CIA, like, why are they going to take orders from some freaking, like, hillbilly politician who's, like, a washed-up nobody? You know, like, why would, like, LBJ be their man? You know, it's like the country club CIA wants, like, Lyndon Baines Johnson to, like, be at the helm of their purported like V for Vendetta, like fascist Chad state. Like, I mean, like, that's
exactly.
That doesn't really make a lot of sense, you know.
So yeah, well, that finally brings in the final culprit. And as for a lot of right-wing types, whenever these conspiracy theories emerge, they think of the normal culprits and they're like, well, this isn't very red-pilled to say that they're behind it. So let's make this red pill by blaming our favorite target, which of course is Israel and Mossad. So yeah. Ron Unz and a couple other people believe that Mossad is behind this, even though JFK started the special relationship with Israel and they had tons of Jewish staffers in the administration. Even Robert Kennedy's whole Department of Justice, pretty much all the senior staffers were Jewish. But for some reason, they decided to kill JFK, and they were able to get away with it. So,
well, yeah, and I don't understand. Like, what
do you make of this theory?
I mean, what I make of it is that it's the same. See, I've got a lot of people come at me, both in my private correspondence as well as on the timeline and on my Substack. And I mean, look, for years, people consider me to be basically a safe person, as it were, to talk about, you know, Jewish issues relating to politics. So I've had huge numbers of people come at me with that exact same narrative. Like, well, it's obvious, you know, the Mossad killed Kennedy. And what I always put to them is, but like, why would they do that? And they're like, oh, but look at what they've done to this country, and you know, look at the kind of cultural aggression they avail us to, and look at the USS Liberty. And I'm like, no, I understand all those things. I take it very seriously. But again, like, what possible benefit would they derive by killing Kennedy? Like, it just doesn't even. I mean, I love Unz because he does do some great stuff, and he's high profile, and I think he makes a fairly big impact. That a lot of he reaches audiences that ordinarily people like you and myself would not, and that's positive. At the same time, he reduces a lot of things to kind of Lyndon LaRouche style nuttiness, and his kind of default, like his default straw man is always like, oh, it's the Israelis, or oh, it's the Jewish lobby. And I think it's that simple. I think it's just kind of like his go-to boogeyman, because he views like Mossad, Israel lobby, United States as this kind of like chimeric myrmidon that's, you know, every bad thing or everything that happens outside of the restraint of the law, like somehow is attributable to Israel or some iteration of, you know, Jewish power. I think it's that simple. And yeah, it makes no sense. And you know, Israel in the 60s also, particularly the early 60s, that's when the quote special relationship was ossifying into what it is today. But there was almost a provincial view of things, and most of the command staff of the IDF as well as of the Mossad were not guys who had emigrated from Europe. They were guys who were from the Mandate Palestine. I mean, what I'm getting at is that their worldview was not particularly global at that point. Okay, I do not think that they looked at the U.S. president in any terms other than saying, you know, we need whoever's in the Oval Office to be on our side. I really don't think it went beyond that. But even if it did, again, like how exactly did Israel benefit by killing Kennedy? Like that doesn't make any sense. And it's Kennedy, like Nixon, like Eisenhower. I mean, he pretty unconditionally gave the Jewish state what it wanted in terms of weapons and infusions of capital to, you know, to modernize and sustain infrastructure that was essential to their military demands. You know, it just on its face it doesn't make any sense. You know, like you might as well. It's a completely random accusation, just kind of tossed out there at a favorite straw man target. I mean, that's my take on it.
The two arguments they make for why they killed him is that the Kennedy administration was looking at making Israeli lobbyists register as foreign agents, which wouldn't really have diminished their power, because the reason why Israel is so popular is due to our own citizenry and powerful citizens and wealthy people who are able to advocate for Israel. I don't think that they're like, oh no, now that we have to register as foreign agents, we're so much less effective, even though they have all these powerful donors and other people who can call their congressmen, and they have, at that time, they had 2% or 3% of the population. You know, the Jewish Americans were much more pro-Israel at that time than they are today, because of due to the decline in Jewish identity and a lot of these younger Jewish millennials and Zoomers not really having much connection to Israel. But at that time, the Jewish population was largely supportive of Israel, and they demanded that the government take action. And them having to register as foreign agents wouldn't have stopped that, or it would have been a minor annoyance, not something to the level that they would have assassinated a pro-Israel president over. No, and the second one is that Kennedy was trying to stop them from having nuclear weapons, at the same time giving them tons of weaponry. But as a U.S. policy, they knew that wouldn't probably change under LBJ. I mean, they still really didn't want them to get nukes, but I mean, they still did it anyway. And this were matters in negotiation. I mean, they were basically, it would have hoped that LBJ was so much in their pocket, even though, yes, he was pro-Israel as well, but they wouldn't have known that, you know, LBJ, if we do this, you won't make us register as foreign agents and you'll let us have nukes. And that's not necessarily the case. And they really didn't have the power to get away with this. I mean, the CIA has long not had a particularly good relationship with Israel, even though in some theories people think Israel runs the CIA. And I think you could see with John Brennan recently condemning the assassination of an Iranian scientist as terrorism that must be dealt with, even though that was clearly done by Israel. In that theory, they'd be like, what? The CIA is condemning Israel? That's not possible. Israel controls the CIA. Not quite. And if the CIA would have known that, would have totally, with all their bumbling, would have known that Mossad took out our president, and they'd be like, what? And Eisenhower in '56 had stood up against Israel against the Suez Canal crisis. So it wasn't necessarily Israel controlled our entire government. I mean, yes, Israel has a lot of influence over our government, and they do influence our actions in a way that, you know, no other nation should. And there should be, of course, limits on their influence. But in the way that they're able to call up the CIA and the rest of our government tell them, hey, we're killing your president. They're like, okay, it's okay. Thanks, Shlomo. We'll let you kill him. And that's not necessarily going to happen.
No, the whole thing's crazy, but it's also too. I mean, even aside from the fact that that's a crazy theory, it's like we discussed, initially when you raised the topic. It's like, okay, let's say even all these people, had the incentive and the motivation to destroy Kennedy, whether it is, for the sake of argument, whether it was LBJ or the Mossad or whatever. Again, Kennedy was a guy with a sexual behavioral problem and a drug problem in the early 60s. Like, you want to know how you destroy JFK in 1963? Deploy a photographer to one of these rendezvous that he sets up and, snap a roll of film and then, develop it and then distribute it to every major news outlet. And guess what? Like, there's no more President Kennedy. There's President Kennedy going down in flames and then, getting booted out of office in 64. It's like, why that's really the way you destroy a politician in America. It's like, why generally, like, your remedy of first resort is what I'm getting at, is like not to blow the man's head off. Like, that's just not really the way things work.
They clearly had female agents to go in and just have sex with them and then record the whole thing and like, sorry, you're done. If they really thought that his FARA idea and his opposition to them gaining nukes was that important, they would have just done that and game over for Kennedy. Or they would have just held it as blackmail. It was like, you're going to stop. That would have been much more beneficial to them. But they didn't do that. So I doubt that theory.
Yeah, and it's also too, I mean, Israel was in a peculiar position in the Cold War, and I mean, Nixon, I've got a lot of esteem for Nixon for a lot of reasons. I mean, he's a mixed bag, but one of the things one gleans from the Nixon tape is that Nixon knew exactly what Israel was, and he really, really despised the Jewish lobby in America. But the fact of the matter is that there was a Cold War. I don't agree with this policy in this, as it developed historically, but there was a Cold War imperative to supporting Israel for limited purposes. And the fact of the matter is that all the Israelis really had to do was bide their time. And as the Soviet Union approached and then accomplished nuclear parity, which everybody knew they would within a decade at the time of Kennedy's death, it would have become less and less of a priority to guarantee Israel's compliance with non-proliferation measures, because frankly, America would have had to do something to prop up Israel to make up for its lack of forces in being, like, relative to the Soviet client states that opposed it. So, I mean, it's clear to anybody who knows anything about the way the Pentagon, the intelligence establishment, the presidency in America handles these things. Like, obviously, Israel would have ultimately been allowed to procure nuclear weapons or been able to have access to nuclear weapons within their own command and control paradigm, even if they weren't, actually Israeli warheads. But so, yeah, I mean, it doesn't make sense anyway. But yeah, even if it did, even if that was some kind of incentive to act against Kennedy, and that too, it's like this. It's like, okay, let's say for the big argument, you want to kill the president. It's like, are you going to find some guy with a history of mental illness who spends his days like railing against the U.S. government and threatening to kill people, and who is and who carries Communist Manifesto in his back pocket? It's like, okay, I'm not going to corral some like Chad CIA assassin to do the job. I'm not going to find some tried and true, quote unquote mob hitter. I'm going to find this like mentally ill guy who like loves the Soviet Union. Like that's a great idea. I mean, it's like
very reliable person to rely on too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, why on earth, Oswald was pretty much an open book. Like, he really was like he really was an unhinged, violent, basically criminal minded guy who had all kinds of terrible problems in his life and who really, really made problems for himself by his activism and his agitation. I mean, it's not feasible that anybody would want anything to do with him. I do believe, and this is pretty well documented, Cuban intelligence did have dealings with Oswald, and they probably paid him some money. For what, it's not clear, but Cuba, like East Germany, like Czechoslovakia, like the Soviet Union itself to a lesser degree, they were willing to work with anybody who seemed committed to the cause and who could give them proverbial and literal eyes on the ground in America or anywhere else. I mean, that doesn't really prove anything. It's like, okay, I mean, there's probably 10,000 guys like who fit Oswald's profile that Cuban intelligence may have passed money to at some point or another in order to do some, some kind of basic, intel grunt work, or just to be basically like, errand boys for limited purposes, because the Cubans, like the East Bloc, they were limited in the fact that they did not have a presence on the ground on the American continent, like obviously America does and did in Europe. So I mean, that doesn't really indicate anything or demonstrate anything. But yeah, I cannot imagine anybody who, in their right mind, like deciding that Lee Oswald would be a man to assign a sensitive direct action sort of mission, let alone the murder of a president. I mean, it's totally insane. Everything about it's insane.
I agree. And, going back to this for the last point is that I was saying earlier is that 61% of Americans believe there was a conspiracy to kill JFK. So why do you think this particular theory is so popular and it carries on even past generations who, wouldn't even remember JFK? I think the JFK assassination has a particular powerful effect on boomers, especially. There's even millennials and Zoomers who care about the JFK assassination. So why is it so popular in American culture?
Because I think there's a weird political theology to America, and I mean that quite literally. I mean that political and social narratives have really supplanted conventional religious narratives as what people draw upon, to relate to in terms of finding a moral compass, and also just kind of the basic alienation from their own culture, and a lack of really prime symbols to identify with in the official culture. People focus on these individual heroic types in their mind, or what they believe to be heroic types. And like in the Oliver Stone movie, people have confabulated this kind of narrative around Kennedy as like, well, Kennedy was this very decent man, and if he hadn't been murdered, the '60s wouldn't have been this disaster, and America wouldn't have lost its proverbial soul. And I mean, I realize these are incredibly foolish things to think and say, but that's really what people do believe. So I believe Kennedy's a prime symbol of martyrdom in their mind, but also they've got this fantasy that the Second World War was the good war, and all these wonderful things were afoot, and there was this great prosperity in the '50s, and we were marching towards the future of tolerance and this kind of collective peace where people can just pursue wealth and hedonism and not be afraid anymore. But then these evil men, whether they're Chad Wasps or whether they're mob guys or whether they're evil fascists like I am, that they derailed the American dream because they murdered this great man, and then like all these horrible things ensued. I think it's that simple. And obviously in the case of boomers, to me, I'm 44 years old, and the thing that really fucked my world up in terms of civic memory is when Waco happened. Like, that made a huge impact on me and many, many other men, and some ladies too, like our age or my age. But I think the shock of the president being murdered, for boomers who witnessed it and lived through it, I think they couldn't really get their mind around the fact it might have been just something as simple as an unhinged, violent, criminal-minded individual decided to murder the president. Because a world where that can occur to them, and considering the way they've internalized these kinds of political narratives in moral terms, grossly out of proportion to what they actually represent, it's essential to kind of their psychic well-being to not just to martyr Kennedy, but to develop this kind of grand conspiracy of evil around it, because it helps them structure their world in terms that don't, frighten the hell out of them, and that they can actually understand. I realize that sounds highly speculative, but I think about this a lot, and I think I'm onto something. I mean, that's my view of it.
Well, it's the same in my generation in 9/11, and as your generation with Waco, is that this is a devastating event, and people just can't think that this happened, there must be an explanation. And with the boomers, that JFK conspiracy theories were very popular. 9/11 trutherism is very popular among millennials and Generation Z, because that's a central event, and people don't like this idea that just a bunch of criminals or terrorists could have done this, that there must be some secret conspiracy behind that. But that is certainly a topic for another episode, and We are out of time tonight, but today, because this is premiering during the daytime. So no Patreon questions for this episode, as I'm saving them up for the next episode, which should be recorded later this week. Thomas, tell the good people what work you have coming up and how they can follow and support you.
Absolutely. You can follow me at realthomas77 or at realthomas77.substack.com. That is my Substack. It's about I lay content on there every day, about half of which is absolutely free, about half of which is by subscription. But even if you don't want to subscribe, you can get on the email list, and there is daily free content. Sometimes a lot, sometimes a little, but it does drop every day. I'm on Twitter at just at realthomas777. I've got a book dropping on the issue of the Nuremberg trial and the Nuremberg trials rather. This book will drop in March. I don't have a firm day in March, or date rather, but it will be March 2021. It's being put out by Imperium Press. They are fantastic and very cool rock and roller type studs who have been very good to me. The book is essentially about how globalism, the ethical underpinning of globalism is Nuremberg, and how the precedent established at Nuremberg replaced the previous order of state sovereignty, by which, you know, the sovereign order of states was considered to be something sacrosanct that could not legitimately be undermined by any supranational authority. And obviously that all changed very dramatically. And the book on Nuremberg is essentially about globalism and global legal order, but it is written in terms that any layman can understand. And I believe that anybody who takes interest in these topics will get a lot out of it. I'm dropping a lot more published content throughout 2021, but that's the most prominent project I'm working on, and that is the one that will be first.
Awesome. So we'll be looking forward to that. And of course, we'll have you on again in the near future. But thanks again for coming on, Thomas.
No, thank you, Scott. It's been really great.
All right. And you're welcome. And until next time, stay respected.